Welcome everyone. Very happy to have you today. We can just get started. It's really a pleasure to have you. This is our second webinar, how to create more value when buying consulting services. Today we'll do kind of a dive into the RFP. You can find the first webinar on our YouTube channel, Consulting Quest, without surprise. And I know there are lots of consultants and procurement executives that are present today, so I hope to hear your thoughts and your feedback at the end of the presentation. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. And so if you have questions during the webinar, don't hesitate to use the question box in order to have your question there. And we will start with the one that are already there. But, with no further ado, let's dive into today's topic, the infamous RFP process. My first question when we talk about RFP is like, did you know that only 7% of executives feel that they're well equipped to buy consulting services? 7%, that's not much, right? But still, in many companies, procurement is not involved in the purchase of consulting or at the very last minute to negotiate when everything is already set in stone. And by the way, they are asked to do miracles, in particular, get wonderful prices. Why are they not called earlier? Because they could really bring value to the table. And actually, their job is to handle RFP process. For instance, they could make sure that their internal client does not send confidential information to consultant without an ADA. Of course, no one here is doing that. By experience, I can tell you that happens. That's a true story. Well, everything I say after that is a true story, unfortunately. They could also make sure that the consulting agreement has clear deliverables. It's not always the case, unfortunately. And also, they could help organize competitions when necessary. So all those examples are things that some procurement executives told me that they faced in their job, and they're trying to help to do things better. But when procurement is arriving at the last minute, they're just backpedaling to ensure that there's a fair process and to mitigate the risks. And they have less freedom to really bring value to the process. So why would they accept being placed in that situation in another procurement category? They would not in consulting. And actually, consulting is, buying consulting services, it's not rocket science. It has a lot of similarities with other purchases. So there's a twist there. It is that consulting is intangible. And this is why the RFP is key. So let's get started. So today I wanted to go over how to draft an RFP. And it starts with, kind of some basics about the RFP for consulting, why it's so important, and what value it can bring. And then we can just, get started. What are the prerequisites before, drafting an RFP, how to define your requirements, and finally, how to define the selection process. I will get started with why is it so important? Because I know, and you know, that there's not always an RFP when you buy consulting services. RFP process doesn't mean necessarily competition. Let's be very clear about that. RFP for me means clarifying the requirements and articulating into an RFP. The first reason why it's so important is because unless you have, explained what were your requirements, it's going to be very hard to find what type of consulting firm you could work with. And the truth is that one consulting firm that we worked with before on a given project is not necessarily the right one for the next one. Unless you're clear on what you're looking for, then you cannot know about that. The next reason why it's so important is because if you don't define the scope of your project, you cannot know what internal stakeholders will be impacted by the outcome of that project. And here we're talking about change management and the fact that if you are able to involve the stakeholders early on in the process in defining the scope, in agreeing and aligning on the expectations of the project, then you kind of maximizing the chances of success of your project. Another reason why it's so important is the timing, because the timing in which a project is delivered, it's a balance between the scope and the staffing and your internal, milestones. And so you need to understand that in order to make potential trade-offs to get you the best result in the right time with the right staffing. Then let's go to focus on results. This one is extremely important. Consultants, most of the time, and if we talk about management consultants, strategy consultants, etc., they commit on results. They don't commit on means. And unless you define what results you expect in terms of objectives, in terms of deliverable, how could they commit on that? And if you don't give deliverables, then you're just opening the door to some sort of a time and material project. And with very, very high level consultant, that can be quite expensive. And that's not what they want, and that's not what you want. And everybody could be disappointed. You want to, when it's possible, and it's not always relevant, but when it's possible and relevant, you want to organize a fair competition. And when you have already incumbents, they know your business, they know your context, they know what you've done before on a given topic. And if you don't write that down, and if you don't share that to the newcomers that you want to invite to an RFP, then they are at a disadvantage in that process. And the truth is that when you run an RFP process with a competition, your goal is not to have one win. Your goal is to be able to choose from several very good proposals. And so you need to put them in the best conditions to deliver those solid proposals. And now we're going to talk about results and potential problems. Contracts. I always use that comparison. I say, a consulting project is a little bit like a marriage. Everything is fine until it's not. And the thing is, if you haven't prepared on how to terminate a project, whether it's at the end and you're not satisfied, or it's in the middle because it doesn't deliver, then you are in a tough situation. And so if you have clarified your expectations and you have clarified what success looks like and what deliverables you're looking for, then if the consultant does not deliver, and that can be many reasons that not necessarily all linked to the consultant actually, then you can have some basis to discuss and to find a way out. And it means either kind of put the consultants back on track, or it can be just terminate the project early. And finally, the last two elements, probably the most important. One is the cost. The cost of a consulting project is directly linked to the scope of the work or the workload. So it has a direct impact. How large you want your project to be will have a direct impact on how much time it will take to deliver and its cost. And it's the same for the impact, is that if your results are not feasible, then the impact will not be there because the consultants cannot deliver. So it's like any other purchase. I mean, defining the needs is key in the process. We all know that. But in consulting, it has to be done in a certain way. So you, at the same time, clarify the expectation, but do not restrict the consultant too much. So they can bring their intelligence to the table. They can bring the expertise and methodologies. So that's why it's so important. And you see that apart from one reason, which is fair competition, everything else is applicable even if you're not organizing a competition. So do you always need an RFP? Not always. It means that, of course, you need to define your expectation, but it's not always the right tool for a project. And it will depend on how mature you are on your project. If you are wondering if you should launch a project, if you are, looking at what your options, and you don't have defined your needs or made the scoping, you're really at the ideation step, then your best option is probably to go for an RFI, which is a request for information. But if you already have your needs laid out and you have started the scoping and you're wondering what type of consultant can help me attain these objectives, then indeed you should work with a request for proposal. So those two tools are very helpful. They can be combined actually. So how do you know which one is right for your project? So it will really depend on when you start. If you are clear on the project that you want to tackle, or if you're not. If you're not clear, then you should go for request for information. You gather some consultants and you explore, you ask them what type of services they do, and you get some presentation, and they present their methodologies and type of project they've done before. The kind of you explore, what you could do, kind of rather broadly. If you are clear on your problem, but you don't know yet what type of approach you want to get, then you can have kind of a mixed process with a first round where you kind of broaden the base to several consulting firms, RFI-like type of round. And then when you've decided what type of approach look like what you're looking for, then you can converge with less consulting firms to an RFP round. And that's something that works very well, in particular if you are wondering, if you're kind of a crossroads with several capabilities, if you're between strategy, innovation, and marketing, for instance, and you can look at several type of consulting firm, bring them on, get them to explain to you how they would do in a very high level, and then say, no, that doesn't sound what we're looking for. That's more this one, and then you can narrow down to one capability or one type of consulting firm. If you are clear on your problem and you know what type of approach you want to get, and you're flexible on the delivery model and the format, then you can have an open RFP where the consultant can get creative. I'll explain a little bit later what I mean by that, what is an open RFP. But the idea is that when you're writing your RFP, you can either be very classical, have your deliverables, and very, define your objective, and you can start defining of what your milestones and some of the elements that you want absolutely to see. Or you can have something more open where you just define the minimum, which is, of course, the context and the deliverables and the objective, and then you let the consultants to bring you some new ideas. So this is kind of how you can know what's best for your project. Kind of lets you kind of at a glance what that is. When you use a request for information, indeed, you have more time. You won't use an RFI if you need your project for tomorrow. That won't work because it's an exploration phase. And after you've done your RFP round or RFP process, then you will have an RFP process. So you have to, have more time. You rarely have NDAs at that time, and you rarely share confidential information. And that means that probably what the consulting firm will present you is a little bit more high level or generic. You have a budget estimation, but you don't have specific references. And very important, it's not always possible. An RFP, on the contrary, can be extremely fast. You have an NDA, or I would recommend to have one. You can have a price, you can ask for specific references, and you always possible. Two things that I wanted to tell you about that, in particular RFI, is that sometimes companies tend to abuse the RFI process. So what they do is that they gather a consulting firm, get them to explain how they would do stuff. Then they pick their ideas and they say, well, thank you. And that's it. The problem is that, and it's true for RFI and RFP, don't underestimate the amount of work it represents for the consultants. When they go into an RFP process or an RFI process, they calculate, they estimate their likeliness of getting the project. And they will go if they feel like it's worth it for them. If you kind of pick their brains too often, then they will see you as a risky client and they won't come for your projects. The other reason is that even though they have commercial time and that's what it's for, this is just simple respect for their work. So you can do RFP processes, but you need to have some level of certainty of the project after that. Another point is that if you don't want to or you can't organize an RFI process, and it can happen in particular if you have, sensitive IP or confidentiality involved, then you can organize internal workshops. But the downside is that you won't have access to external expertise, right? So that can be a problem. So how to get started? So how do we see, okay, RFP is important, writing an RFP is important. So how do I get started? the first step is to get the right team on board. So I mentioned before that at the very beginning, I said, you need to have a scope defined so you know what stakeholders will be involved. So this is also more broadly, who are the people who should be in the room when you start discussing about their RFP? First, the project sponsor. So who is that? That's the person who's buying the project, if you will. Then you have the project manager, who's the person who will be managing the project on a daily basis. Procurement leader, of course, and then the main stakeholders, those who will see the impact of this project directly on their activities. And when the project is large or is strategic, then you should have strategy and finance in the room. So you're sure that you're aligned with the strategy and that you respect the budget that's allocated for consulting. So then you need to be very clear on who does what. The key for a good RFP is collaborations between procurement and the business lines. How do you do that? Obviously, the business lines, they know what's the problem. They know what they want, and they're the one who can articulate the needs and the problem to solve, right? The procurement team is here to challenge, to reformulate, to make sure that we only buy what we need, and we're not, falling to the fancy proposition that some consultants may do. They're here to make sure that we keep, the costs under control, and we really get the best impact, the real impact, what we really want. And what they'll do is that they will reformulate the needs and formulate the elements in an RFP. But the one in control here is the business line. They're the one who validate the RFP. This is what I need, and this is what type of consulting firm I want to work with, and this is how I want things to be done. So this is kind of how you handle the process. Another point is what makes an efficient RFP. Because we can talk about what is in there, but now let's talk about how it should look like. The first thing is it has to be clear. You're not writing a novel. You have to describe your needs in a limited number of words. You don't want a 30-page RFP. Actually, the last RFP that I wrote was probably 3-page long, and that was enough for a large strategy project. So what you want to see is that what is the issue you're trying to solve? What are your deadlines? And what are the results you're expecting? Then this RFP needs to be realistic. I'm sure you are ambitious for your company, but you want the consulting firm to be able to make it happen for you. So you need to make sure it's realistic. And if you're not sure, that's where you can talk with the consulting firm and ask them, can you do that? And is it realistic? And most of them will answer very genuinely on that. Another point also, it has to be simple. You have to keep your English simple. And I know it sounds, when you're a native English speaker, it might not be obvious, but now with globalization and many consulting firms work with international consultants, and so the people in front of you may not be native in your own language in which you write the RFP. So please, and it doesn't mean that he won't deliver awesome, outstanding work, and you'll be very, very happy what they do. But the thing is, if you write things that are too complicated, too elaborated, too sophisticated, then you might lose them at some point, just because of that. And that's why I always said, that the simplicity is always a good point in when you write an RFP. Keep things simple, keep things very clear. Well, if it's in English, to have things that are simple, clear, short sentences. It's classic, but it sounds obvious, but it's important. And then the last thing, it's formalized. That RFP is going to be the reference for the consulting firm you invite to the company. That's on what they will build their proposal. So you need to make sure that they're laser focused on your needs and that they understand what is important to you and what is not. They will understand what you expect in the proposal and what you don't care about. And that's very important. Again, building a proposal takes time, it takes energy, and therefore money for them. So, be respectful of their time, give them the path to success, and put them in the right condition to deliver great proposal. Because at the end, you're the one that will benefit from that. You'll have great proposal that fit immediately. It can shorten the process to select the right consultants. It's a win-win situation. So one point, and it goes back to what I mentioned before, which was an open RFP. One thing that is extremely important is to remember that when you buy consulting, you're not buying a service per se. You're not buying a good. You're not buying a chair. You're buying a solution to a problem. What you need to think about is, what information do I need to put in my RFP so my consultant can answer, but also has enough room to offer creative and innovative solution potential. So you need to say, why you do that, what you expect, who is going to do what, but you need to keep some room for them to bring a solution. And let me give you an example. So a few years ago, we worked with a large chemical company, and they wanted to roll down a new organization in one of their business units. And so the organization had been already defined, and they were just looking for a consulting firm to help them, get the buy-in from the teams and define new interfaces and new ways of working. And they did an RFP quite open. And one of the consulting firms came back with a game where they would role play. That was not part of their RFP. But they came with that idea saying, putting, the employees in a role-playing situation will help define and identify the interfaces in a fun and relaxed way. And actually, that consulting firm won the project, and they did that game. So that was not part of the RFP. And that's because my client was able to open the RFP and show there was room for such a creative solution that the consultants felt free to offer that. So that's kind of thing that you can do. It's not always possible. Sometimes you need something extremely precise and extremely classical. But when you don't have specific ideas or needs on the approach or the methodology, let them, offer you their best solution. What's important, what you want to answer, what the questions you want to answer when you include consultants and you receive proposals, there are three questions. First is that, does that consultant understand the issue I'm trying to tackle? The second question is, are they able to tackle that issue? Do they have the expertise? Do they have the resources? And then, will you and the consultants work well together? So it's actually understanding, ability, and fit. That's the question that those propositions should help you answer. And then this is, when you build your RFP, you need to make sure that you give the consultants enough information so when they build the answer, they're able to get you those answers. So that's, now we know why it's important, and we know kind of what are the prerequisites. We can go to the core requirement. What does an RFP for consultants look like? Three things. First, the context. Why do you launch this project, and what are your main expectations? Then, what are your requirements? What is the rationale for the project, the objectives, and the expected outcomes? And last point is the process. How will this unfold? And who are the point of contact? Again, the goal of the RFP is to ensure that the consultants that are invited to the bid submit strong proposals. So first element, the context. So again, at the beginning, I told you that if you wanted to have fair competition, you needed to define some elements of context. If you don't do that, then the consultants that already know you have an advantage because they know who you are. They know the recent evolutions in your company or in your industry, and they know how your project fits in the overall strategy. And so it's going to be easier for them to point exactly to the problem that you want to serve. Because there's so many ways to answer, and the consultants, when they receive a RFP, they need to figure out not only what are your needs, but there's so many ways they can answer that. Even one consulting firm can answer the same RFP in different ways, given what's the context, what the background, what you've done before, what is your cultural, your culture and management style and everything. So all of this comes into play when they build a proposal. So the more you can tell them, the higher chances to get a great proposal. So define your background, who you are, and the level of detail will depend on the degree of intimacy of the consulting firms. If all the consulting firms that are on board already know you, maybe you can skip some of those parts. If you're inviting newcomers, maybe you should take a little bit more time on that background part. Second element is the context of this project. And what is important here is to explain what's your starting point, what you've done so far and how well you did, what are the challenges you're facing, and what you would like the consultant to help you with. This is how you kind of explain what made you look for help on that specific project. So your next step is to define your requirements. So here, this is kind of the core of the RFP. There are many ways consultants can bring value to a project, but then you have to state in very simple language, English, their requirements. First is the rationale for the project. What evolution, issue, or decision led you to launch this project? Second element is what is the high-level objectives? What are you trying to achieve? And what are your main goals? And finally, what are the expected outcomes? And that's the deliverables and the timing they should include in their proposal. So this has to be, again, detailed enough so they know what you expect in the proposal and they know what angle you want them to take. And there are other elements that you can include in your under requirements. For instance, you may have some specific confidentiality requirements. You may have some deliverables or checkpoints that are mandatory, or you can have a board meeting and you want to present the results of that study at the board, then that everything has to be finished before that. Maybe you expect the consultant to do everything, or you want them to work with your teams. And then you have other elements like, it has to be performed on site. So right now with the pandemic, it's more complicated, but some projects can be done on site partially or completely. Do you have specific language requirements? Sometimes projects international and you'd like that on the ground, the consultants that are there speak the language. Or know the culture, and it can really ease the buying of a project if the person that is doing the work knows what's the management style locally, what's the culture and the work culture. And then you might have other things like transferring knowledge, and that's also something that you need to include in the project because it has to be taken into account since the very beginning. So when your context is clear and the objective and deliverable are defined, it's not over. You have still some work to do as per Kim. And what you need to do here is to explain how you will select the winner. This is the only way to make sure that you have a fair process and give to the consulting firms the keys to decide if they want to participate or not in the project. As I said before, participating in an RFP process is a lot of time and energy, and they need to make sure that they have some chances. They won't just do it for the sake of it. They will do it if they feel like they can bring you something and they have a chance to win the project. So you need to describe the selection process. So what are we talking about? Some things are really simple and obvious. It's, okay, let's make sure that they know who they can talk to, what's their point of contact. Then it's important also to explain how you will select the pricing proposal. And the reason why you need to be very transparent on that, it's because a proposal is long enough. For those of you who have received proposal, it can be 30, 40, 50, 70 slides. There's so many things that they can tell you. They have a lot of experience. They have many case studies they can share, and they can present that information with one angle or another one. And depending on what are the criteria, what is important to you, then they can really kind of narrow down the information that is relevant to the specific project and select what case study is right, what team members are right for you, etc. All of this is very important, and it will make the proposal better and more customized to your need. And then it's kind of, again, you're shortening the RFP process, and you're making sure that you have everything at hand to select the right consultants. Then you have to explain what you expect in the proposals. And finally, the key milestone on the selection process. They need to understand if they have 1 week or 2 weeks to remit their proposals. If it's too short and they are, overwhelmed with work, they might say, you know what, we don't have time. And I've seen that. I've seen some consultants very genuinely tell me, look, the selection process is too short. I don't have time to do that. I won't be able to deliver. So I'm sorry, I'm out. And that's fair. That's fair. So you need to describe kind of the key steps in your selection process. Of course, all the steps are not, you don't have to describe everything in length, but you have to be clear on how you will do that. The first step is to distribute the RFP and the intention to bid. But actually, that's a step 0. And that step 0 is to sign an NDA. In particular, if you have confidential information shared. And I've seen recently a company that realized when they were negotiating the proposal that they didn't sign an NDA. And we were talking about highly confidential information. Most consultants won't share that information, but it's really hard to make sure that you will have always people that will respect that. So first, step 0, make sure you have an NDA. It doesn't cost you anything. Second, you send an RFP, and then you can have a Q&A. So, you have a lot of consultants. It's a very big project. You may have kind of a proposal submission Q&A that can be either by writing, or that can be through a brief. And then but if you have a small number of consultants, you may want to just do, you have 3 consultants, you just do a meeting and you get them asking their questions directly during the meeting. This is really up to you, the time you have on your hand and the number of consultants that are involved. But you need to be clear on what is the process before you start. Then how should they send their proposals? That's very important. So they know, because even though you always say, oh, we're going to give them 2 days, 3 days. The truth is that implicitly, or let's say unconsciously more than implicitly, you will have some positive points to the one that's sent on time and sent early. If you're very clear on the timing and you give that until them, they know exactly what you expect, and you have a good chances to have all your proposals on time. Next step is shortlist and presentation of the most promising proposals. Here, we're already narrowing down the number of presentations that we get. So if you don't have a lot of consultants in the beginning, you can get all of them presenting. But if you have like 10 or 12 or 15, even though we don't recommend have too many, you can have a short list of 4 to 5 that are manageable. Then you say when you select your best proposal, and then when you expect the kickoff to happen. So they know exactly what are the different steps, and if it fits with their calendar and their resources, and again, it can help them to decide if they want to come onto that project. When you do your selecting committee, I really recommend involving the main stakeholders. Actually, I recommend involving the same people that were involved in the RFP at the beginning, and to organize face-to-face discussions with the finalists to make sure that everybody is aligned, everybody agrees with what is going to be done. And you can, leverage Skype or Google Hangouts, all of this, and it works very well. Another element that I mentioned is that you need to explicit your criteria of selection. So you should know at that point how you will, select your consulting firms. But let me give you some of the examples, some of the things that are usually used. One is the capability. So you need to make sure that that consulting firm can do the job, and you can leverage feedback from previous clients on previous projects, can be case studies and check references. Another element is the expertise of the firm in the required field. So they can, for instance, you can look at thought leadership or position papers in the area, or also it can be some case studies. A third element is the clarity of the approach and the deliverable. So here you need to make sure that the deliverables are those that you expect, but you also need to understand how the consultant will get there, and if that's what you want. And then you understand and you feel that's right for you. Third element is the composition of the team. So what we mean by that is who is going to work on that project. If you want, for instance, people who are a lot of experience in the telecom industry, for instance, you need to make sure that the people on the field that work have some experience in that field. You need to make sure that they have the right seniority and the right expertise. Then the fit with your company is that do you want to work with them? Sometimes you don't fit with people. It's just about, human to human relationship. And that's one way. And the other thing is that do you think that they will have the right impact and recognition within your company? Because it's not only about you, it's also about all the people internally that they will work with. And finally, of course, the price. Can you afford that service? Are you getting clear value for your money? So you see that the considerations to choose a consulting firm are much broader than the sole price. Of course, the price is important if it's not in your budget or if it fits your budget, actually. But this is not the only reason why criterion that you should use to select your consulting firm. Another thing I think that we often overlook is giving a clear timeline. And I will give you two examples. If you have one project and you are not in a hurry, and you don't have a board meeting, and you ask a consulting firm to deliver, then they say, okay, I can do that in 12 weeks, and it's going to take one manager, 2 consultants. That's it. Then the same scope, the exact same scope, but you have a very important meeting in 8 weeks, and you need kind of a week and a half or a week to, organize your results and prepare the meeting. Then the consultants to deliver on the same scope will need a different team organization. He will need to put more people, more senior people to make sure it's compressed into that. And so you're going to pay more ultimately, because you're going to pay a premium for getting that and a kind of a express version. So knowing your schedule is key, because it's key for the consulting candidates, so they can tell you, yes, I can do or not, I have the resources. And also it can impact directly who is going to be on the team and how much it will cost. So it's important to share those information. There are a few other things that you can add to the table, references, eligibility criteria. Some companies have very strict eligibility and, procurement policies, and they have pre-qualification procedures. That's important. One thing that is really important is to make sure that you have only one point of contact, because if you let the consulting firms connect directly with the executive of their choice, you give an unfair advantage to the incumbents and you distort the competition. And I've seen recently some executives that were giving false information to the consultants that they didn't want in order to get them to not get a contract. And so be careful. If you want a fair competition, one way or the other, it can work both ways. Stay within the rules, get a single point of contact, and go through that. And that's how you can get a fair competition. And last thing is, that's very important, and it's almost never done. Give some clues about your budget to the consultants, especially if you're on a very tight budget. The consultants can help you build design to cost proposal. What does that mean? It means that instead of going from, the scope to the cost, they will get from the cost and then they will design the scope that fits that budget, but also answers your needs as much as possible. And then you can discuss, marginally on if you add this or that, and you look at only your must-have. And that works. You can get great proposal, right on point, exactly what you want within your budget if you're willing to accept to be challenged by the consultant and listen to their proposals and listen to what they can offer in your budget. So this is something that it's a very powerful tool, especially if you have a tight budget or the consultants end up much higher than what you can afford. That's it. I'm done for this. Are there any questions?
Thanks ever so much, Hélène. There've been quite a few things posted through the question box, but they've mostly been
like me.
People's suggestions of things you might focus on, or adding examples of things you've talked about. So we can stay on the line for just a moment longer.
Yes,
in case
someone said that asking for case studies and a few that are showcase help to as part of the selection. Indeed, it's part of of how you make sure that the people can do the work that you ask. So indeed, having case studies is very interesting to see what a project could look like and how it will answer, how that specific consulting firm has experience answering problems like yours.
And the other actual question rather than comment that came through was just around getting the recording.
Alongside the requirements section, suggest also stating, okay, Axel, this is too long. I'm sorry, I can't see the questions in the large version, so I have just 2 lines and it's quite difficult
Okay.
to answer. Tony, can you give me a hand here? Because I have an issue.
So Hélène, there aren't really so many questions as just people giving examples of things building on the ideas.
Okay, so here's a question. Does it not depend on whether the contract is for services to assist as opposed to a fixed price contract where the vendor is in the driving seat and legally on the hook for the deliverables? Yeah, of course, that's what I said before. It's time and materials versus flat fee. The thing is, when you talk about management consulting, for instance, strategy consulting or procurement, we're more onto something that is either flat fee or performance-based fees, or something that value sharing fees. So when you're on time material, in those specific cases, rather rare. It can be a retainer, for instance. So this is a bit different. You won't have such a heavy process if you have you're discussing a retainer. It's sometimes difficult to get deliverable at that point. It's difficult to have specific outcomes. It can be just supporting the management team for something. Indeed, it's not always the case, but those cases are rather marginal when we talk about that, but agree that it's not like 100% the case.
There are quite a few questions come through now, Hélène. One of them's saying you talked about having a Q&A session in the RFP process. What would you see as the advantages and disadvantages of sharing the answers with all?
So Mark is asking, you mentioned Q&A session in your RFP process. What are the advantages and disadvantages of sharing the answers with all the consultants? So that's a very good point. What I hear here is the following. If you want to share a fair process, you need to share the question as much as possible with all the consultants. But some consultants have more experience and can get some information that can be extremely relevant through those Q&A sessions, and that's based on their expertise. And they can feel like it's not fair to share with the other one that we're not able to bring that level of expertise to the process. So I'd say it depends. I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but I truly think that sharing as much as possible clarifications on the scope and the granularity of the work that has to be done is important. Then when it's about more, expert questions and things that are really starting to scratch the surface and explore solutions, then it's really up to the organizer to share it or not. I would say that I agree on the fact that where the consultant is really bringing his expertise, that should stay off. Damien is asking, what would be the interest of having a framework with a regular consultant? So that's a very good point. Indeed, with a regular consultant, you can have a framework, but that depends on what type of work you're doing with them. You can not have all the requirements that are already like in a framework, right? So what you will have is having an agreement at the beginning, and then you know that you're going to work with them on the long run. So you can have a simplified RFP, meaning that you're not organizing a competition. You probably won't go to the context. You will have just basically the requirements and discuss with them what could be the deliverables and what are the high-level objectives, and that would be it. But you cannot have some sort of generic RFP that goes very long unless it's a retainer. And again, retainers don't necessarily comes with deliverables. But if it's a regular consultant, but you want to do several projects with them, you will have to spend a little bit of time to have a simplified RFP. So Mary is telling me, we typically do a Q&A about 2 days after an RFP is released. Explicit purpose is to ensure the bidders understand our requirements. After that, it's individual Q&A, which is suppliers are necessary. Yeah, that's a very good point. To do that, it can explain all the different elements. The thing is, sometimes we want to have a confidential process, and so you don't want to have all the consultants in the same room or in the same call. So it's really, well, there's no necessarily one right way that is good for everything, but I'd say that it really depends on the project, the level of confidentiality, how secretive you want to be. But I agree, what is important is that you need to make sure that the bidders understand your requirements. They have that relationship where they can ask their questions and get the answers so they can submit the right proposals. So Luisa telling, it's important to get C-suite buy-in to generate an RFP that would categorize the consulting spend. It was all of you to have a preferred consulting supplier list. Yes, that's an excellent point. What is really important, and to have the C-suite, explain the expectations and be able to anticipate what could be the needs in the future. So it's not necessarily an RFP, kind of a specific RFP process on a given project, but you can already identify at very high level what kind of project you would want to do, and then start working and identifying consulting firm, even though the project is not there yet, get them to explain who they are. It's kind of a light RFI process. And then you identify which one could be suited for potential project down the road, and build a list of preferred suppliers, those capabilities. So that's a very good point to go there. How would you, Akash is asking, how would you go about trimming the existing management consulting spend within an organization? That's a very broad question, but that's a very relevant point. I think that the first step, is to look at the past and look at two things. Did I work on the right projects? And was that project relevant? Was it strategic? Was it a must-have? And was it a high priority project? That's one way. Then you look at second level, which is, did I really need to do that externally, or could I have done that internally? So it's kind of a make or buy thinking. And then the third one is that, did I write with the right consultants? And was I happy with the impact I got? If you go back and look at that, and it can be done over 1 or 2 years, depending on how large your consulting spend is. And you can look at that and say, okay, so in 30% of the time or 40% of the time, the project that I launched when it's strategic, then that means that those projects could have been avoided. Or maybe you could have done other ones, but maybe not all of them. So this is how you kind of, you just reduce the size of your spend just mechanically and saying, we will focus on strategic project or enablers to strategic project, and you really kind of screen all those projects, you put in place demand management that is smart, that is at the same time, controlling at a high level the very large project, but also giving enough, freedom to the executives to have those small projects that they need. Then you have to look at make or buy. Should I really externalize that, or are there in other part of the organization teams that could do the work? And finally, work with the right consultants. Some people tell me, we should stop working with the big ones. We should work with only the small ones. I'm not, pushing for that at all, because I think that every consulting firm has kind of a portfolio of projects that they do very well, and that's where you want to work with them. So maybe it's a big one you need, maybe it's a medium one, maybe it's a small one, maybe it's a niche, it's very expert, maybe it's a generalist. The point is understanding what consulting firms can bring you the most value, and that's how you really get your spend under control, because you will work with the big ones when you need their political value, and you will work with smaller ones when you have very technical, very operational projects. And all in all, you will spend less money on your consulting and you have better results. Laura is asking me, how do you take advantage in the seasonality of consulting? So this is a tough one. Tough is not the real term. That's an interesting one. Let's say consultants, they're not staffed all year long. And very often they have a lot of work in the beginning of the year, because all of you guys, you prepare your budgets at the end of the year, November, December, sometimes it's up to March, because some companies take a little bit longer to clarify what is the budget. But let's say that the first 6 to 9 months of the year are very, very busy. But then at the end of the year, that might be, less things in less project in the pipeline. So if you're able to either come at a moment where they have some consultants that are idle, or if you're able to wait until that moment when they're done with other project, you can get really good prices, because it's always the idea of the same cost. They're paid for the salaries, they're paid for the wages, and then any project at that point when the pipeline is empty, any project, even I wouldn't say at cost, but lower fees, all of them are good to take. So if you're able to come at that end of the year and really launch that project before December, for instance, then you can get very interesting discounts. And that works also for the big consulting firms. Don't think it's only the small ones. Big consulting firms can also give big discounts. You just have to be there at the right time. Okay. Mary is asking, how do you negotiate price if suppliers are submitting different solutions and you've qualified multiple suppliers and solutions? So it's a very good question. The thing is, in consulting, when you negotiate, you are not only negotiating the price, you're negotiating a little bit of everything, because price is linked to scope, is linked to team composition. So we're going back to how important the RFP is. The RFP is extremely important because it can help you define what you're looking for, what are the outcomes you want, and what the deliverables you're looking for. But when you start negotiating, let's imagine that you have like 3 proposals and they are like 20% or 25% over your budget, and you want to go into your budget. So you can start saying, okay, I think it's too expensive. Okay, we play the game, we're negotiating, we ask for a discount. We often get one if they haven't given it yet, but we can get it first discount. But that's not going to get us to 20 or 25%. We're going to be under that. But we can get a discount. But then when you want to go further, there are some other elements in the proposal that you can touch, but they won't get you much further than 5%. So you still have 10%. You're still over 10% over your target. And the only way to get there is to talk about the scope. It's to refine the scope and refine the timing, because that's where you have the most potential for increasing the price. So if you're able to just modify slightly either the scope, the breadth of the work, or the depth of it, the granularity in which you want the work to be done, then you can slightly, change the scope, and then you can reduce the price. So that's how you do that. You cannot compare proposals, solutions, one next to the one. It's kind of apple to orange. So before we get there, you need to choose what approach sounds better for you, what team sounds, fitting better with you, with your teams, what expertise seems the more relevant, and then grade all those elements, and you start negotiating so everyone fits in your price, and then you trying to be as objective as possible in your decision. But you have to look way beyond the price to make a decision, because sometimes one of them will be a little bit more expensive and maybe a little bit over your budget, but that would be a solution that fits all the other criteria. And maybe that's the one you want to work with. All right, I think I've solved almost of the questions. I'm gonna finish here. Thank you everyone for your question, for your interest. It was really fantastic. The webinar will be posted on YouTube, and we'll share with you in a few before the end of the week. And also our next webinar will happen on, it's not next month actually, it's in 2 months, it's in April, and we'll talk about how to manage the consulting project as a client. It's about how, when the contract is signed, how you can maximize the chances of success of your project, so you make sure that the consultant is in the right condition to deliver, and you get the best outcome for your project. That's it. Thank you everyone, and thank you for being there, and see you soon. Bye.